Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Zoom into Wine. It's time for the show and your host, Ian Blackburn.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Wednesday Zoom into Wine tasting event. My name is Alexandra, and I worked for Ian for just over 3 years. And as some of you may know, he's in Italy right now, leading a group of guests on a wine travel journey and exploration of fine Italian wine. And due to the immense time zone difference, I'll be monitoring the Zoom this evening on his behalf. But the good news is you're in great hands. Our special guest host and expert tonight is the celebrated, anticipated, highly lauded, and tremendous woman of wine, Dana Farner, who will be leading us on a dive into Pinot Noir and a couple of fabulous special bottles from Burgundy and Oregon. And so before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone that this is a community-oriented tasting event. So please don't be shy, and questions and comments are welcome, especially in the Zoom chat box, which you may be familiar with and can be found at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, I will let Dana lead us on this journey right now. I'm gonna pin you, Dana, so everyone can see you.
Great.
And then we will start the presentation. And we'd love to hear all about you and your background in wine. So yeah.
Excellent. And will you be putting up the
Yes, I will. I will share that
Perfect.
for you.
Great. Lovely. Well, it's wonderful to meet you all. I'm Dana Farner. I was a sommelier for many years. I worked at a restaurant in New York City called Blue Water Grill and at a restaurant in Beverly Hills called Cut, Wolfgang Puck's Steakhouse. I opened that restaurant as sommelier and beverage director. And that's where I really dug into, all the depths of wine. It's at Cut that I first met Ian and had a great time working with him on many different projects and in many different ways. And I'm thrilled to be here with you tonight. Pinot Noir is a very exciting grape. There's a picture. I love that picture of me. That's a picture of me that I believe Ian took when we were judging a wine competition together. And I couldn't show my teeth because they were deeply wine stained. But Pinot Noir, I remember when I was first studying wine, all of the wine geeks, all of the sommeliers, all of the people that you talked to about wine anywhere you went would talk about how amazing Burgundy is. Burgundy's the greatest wine in the world. Burgundy's incredible. Burgundy's the best. And I had tasted some Burgundies, but I hadn't tasted great Burgundies. And I went to all the people that were studying wine, all the people that were deeply into wine, and I'd say, can you help me understand? Can you help me learn Burgundy? Can you teach me why Burgundy is so great? And subsequent to that, I've had the opportunity to taste some of the greatest Burgundian wines in the world, some wines with age, some wines from the top vineyards and the top producers in the world. And I've learned more and more about the wine. But one of the things that I did learn was that it wasn't just my naivete that made it hard for me to love Burgundy. Pinot Noir in general, and Burgundy especially, is a little bit of a diva. The grape itself is a diva. It's a very hard to manage grape, hard to grow, hard to make incredible wine out of. But once it is made into wine, it's not one of those wines that you can crack a bottle anytime, day or night, and it's always going to be perfect. Burgundy is a wine that sometimes you'll open a bottle and it's just not right there. Or sometimes you'll open a bottle and it's amazing right out of the first glass you pour, it's incredible. And then you come back to it a half hour later and it's like, where did it go? What happened to it? And sometimes the opposite is true. You open the bottle, you pour a glass, you take a taste of it, and you say, huh, it's just, what's going on here? And then you let it sit for a half hour or for an hour, or you have a bottle with dinner and it's never really incredible, but there's a little bit in the glass, and just at the end of the night you take a sip and you go, oh, there it is. So when I was at Cut, I instructed that myself and the serving team that we would all decant all red wines. Whatever red wine it was, we would decant it because it would give it a little air and let it open up at the meal. But I said, don't decant Pinot Noir. Never decant Pinot Noir. And sometimes, if the guest would request it, I would absolutely decant it. Sometimes I would, take a whiff of it and I would just know it should be decanted and I would decant it. But I always was hesitant because you never know that glorious moment when a Pinot Noir is going to taste its absolute ultimate best. What if you decanted that away? What if it was like at that point between decanting and you missed it? So I just always said, don't decant. If you pour a glass and you want it decanted, you can always decant it later, but you can't undecant a wine. So I never decanted Pinot Noirs. As a matter of course, I didn't decant Pinot Noirs. There were certainly some that I grew to know, oh, this is a bigger Pinot Noir, it needs a little bit of air, or it's younger, or a certain vintage, and I would tend to decant them. But for the most part, I left them alone and let them open up on their own. All right, you can go to the next slide. So we talked a little bit about the Pinot Noir wine being a bit of a diva. The grape itself is a bit of a diva as well. And this is a picture, it's not the most spectacularly, the pixels probably aren't 100% awesome, but I took this picture from one of my favorite wine books. It's called Wine Grapes by Jancis Robinson and her team. And in this book, she goes through every known grape in the world, and the more popular grapes get a drawing in the book. And I thought this was a beautiful drawing of Pinot Noir. So I scanned this and put this in the presentation. One of the most popular ideas as to why Pinot is called Pinot is that it is a derivative of pine, like a pine cone, because the grape bunches, and you can kind of see it there, look sort of like pine cones. And so people think that might be why it's called Pinot Noir. There is another school of thought that says that there's a village called Pinot that was where it was first harvested, and that might be why. But I kind of like the story that it's called Pinot because it's shaped like a pine cone. And a few of the reasons why Pinot Noir is a bit of a diva are on the left there. It's an early budding grape. So that doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but if you're in a, more difficult climate like Burgundy, if you bud early and then a frost comes after the vine, after it starts budding, then you've lost all of those buds. And sometimes the vine can start all over and you can get more buds in the same vintage, but you can lose a huge portion of the vintage to an early frost because it's so early budding. It's also early ripening. So that means that you need to keep an eye on it and make sure that you're picking it before it gets over ripened. And it really likes the vine likes moderate climates. So you look at Burgundy, that's a moderate climate. It's cold in the winter and moderately warm in the summer. You look at Oregon, that makes sense. It's a cooler area up there. If you've ever traveled up north into Oregon, it's a little bit cooler. But if you go into California, you'd think California is warm. How can they make such great Pinot Noirs in California? Well, the reason that a lot of producers are able to make really great Pinot Noir in California is because there's these cool microclimates all the way up the coast, particularly near the coast, where that Pacific fog rolls in. It cools down the mornings and it cools down the evenings and allows Pinot Noir to not get overly sunburned or overly ripened, and you can get great wine from that. So I think you all look like you're ready to start tasting some wine. So why don't we begin? You can go to the next slide and we'll talk about the Stringtown. Stringtown is one of those Oregon Pinot Noirs that I was just mentioning. Stringtown is from Willamette Valley, Oregon. And Willamette Valley is, it's been renowned as one of the places where even winemakers from Burgundy will come over to the United States and say, yeah, this reminds me of the climate where I am. This seems like the right kind of place to grow Pinot Noir. It's at the same latitude as Burgundy, and so that also helps it make sense climatically. And the soil types are very beneficial to Pinot Noir as well. Because Willamette Valley is a special place, a lot of the wines, the Willamette Valley Pinot Noirs, are very, very expensive. And this bottle is not very, very expensive. And the reason why is because it's made by a man named Bruce Beal. And Bruce Beal, he grew up in Montana, but was in love with wine grapes and moved with his brother and his sister to Eugene, Oregon, where they all started making wine. His brother ended up starting King Estates in Oregon, which is an estate that you might have heard of. And he and his sister worked at Eugene Wine Company, and they went in the direction of seeking out vineyard sources from all up and down the Willamette Valley in order to be able to find great grapes that they could make great wine, but it wouldn't have to be so very expensive. So they especially seek out, and it's Bruce that does the Stringtown project. He's particularly seeking out organically farmed vineyards. They're not always 100% organically farmed, but that's his ideal, is to find organically farmed vineyards and source 100% Willamette Valley fruit for the Stringtown. So the Stringtown has the consistency of always being Willamette Valley. It has the consistency of the elegant light touch of winemaking that Bruce Beal puts into each bottle, but it's not necessarily the same vineyards year after year after year. And let's get our nose in the glass. Oh my gosh, this is smelling good today. Do any of you feel like sharing what you're tasting or what you're smelling? I'm getting a ton of raspberry on this. Just like a bowl of fresh, slightly crushed raspberries, and strawberries as well. It's in a good place. My glass is in a good place. Are all of your glasses in a good place right now? It's not being too diva-y today. Good. Good. So this is a map. This is from Willamette Valley Vintners. The Willamette Valley Vintners website has just a trove of information where you can find a bunch of great stuff. So you can see in the upper left, there's the little map of Oregon. And you can see that the Willamette Valley is way up in the northwest corner of Oregon, not all the way to the coast, but the valley off of the coast to the east of the Coastal Mountain Range and to the west of the Cascade Mountain Range. So that's the valley that it's in. And it goes all the way from Eugene up to Portland. And there's the Willamette River, which the valley is named after. And all of these little red dots are all subregions of these little McMinnville and Dundee. They're actually cities, but those are also subregions. McMinnville is a subregion. Dundee is a subregion of the Willamette Valley. And so there are very specific areas within the Willamette Valley, and sometimes you'll see those specific areas listed on a bottle. One other interesting point about Oregon Pinot Noirs. In the United States, it is legal to put the name of a grape on a bottle as long as the wine is made up of at least 75% that grape. So if you buy a bottle that says Cabernet Sauvignon, you know that it's at least 75% Cabernet Sauvignon, but it does not in the United States have to be 100% Cabernet Sauvignon. Oregon takes Pinot Noir so seriously that they have their own law within Oregon that if there's an Oregon wine that says Pinot Noir on it, it must be 100% Pinot Noir. So if you see California Pinot Noir, it might be 75% Pinot Noir and you don't know what else is in it. But if you see Oregon Pinot Noir, you know it's 100% Pinot Noir. They are not going to mess around with that. Does anybody have any questions about this wine or Oregon Pinot Noir or Oregon or wine?
Lori, I feel like you might have something to say.
Great.
Want us to just talk?
Yeah, you can talk.
Tell us how you're enjoying it.
I think this is delicious. I feel like they're in Newburgh and some of these regions that I've never sort of seen where they are before. It's interesting to me. I feel like there's a lot of new wines from those regions. Can you speak to whether the regions themselves are developing differently or are there new hotspots?
Well, there are new hotspots, and there's actually a new hotspot that's a cool spot, and it is, and I'm not seeing it on here. It's a gap. It's a gap that comes in through the coastal mountain range, and I'm going to see if I can find where it is.
And are most of the wineries and vineyards in this region, they've been around a really, really long time, or are most of them new?
There are a lot that have been around a really long time. But there are also some that are coming up new. You know, if you are a young person and you want to start making wine, you know, and you want to have access to some vineyards, you kind of can't go to California really anywhere anymore. All of the vineyard land is super, super expensive. And it's just hard to find grape sources that aren't just, you know, ridiculously very, very expensive. So a young winemaker will often go up to Oregon up into Washington, because there's still the possibility of getting a little bit of vineyard land there. And so you'll see young wineries starting out there. I'm working now with a winery called Suzor. That's a young couple making Pinot Noir. They have a little bit of vineyard land that they have on their own, but it's a brand new label. First vintage was like 14 or 15. So that's brand new. But then there are also some venerable estates that have been around for years and years and years. Oregon is also the place where a lot of people who've made wine in other places go sort of as their dream destination, especially those people that are big Burgundy fans. So there's a master sommelier named Larry Stone who, finally got his dream of having his own winery, and he got his winery in Oregon. And another man named Robert Britton, it's Brittan, was the winemaker for Stag's Leap Vineyards in Napa Valley. Great Cabernet Sauvignon maker, and he mentored a lot of young winemakers through the years. His dream was not to continue to make Cabernet Sauvignon for the rest of his life. His dream was to make great Pinot Noir. And I think, it kind of goes back to that story about how it's a diva and how you're always striving to get that. Like, it's like this quest for the ultimate Pinot Noir, the ultimate American Pinot Noir. And so when he left Stag's Leap Vineyards, he bought vineyard land in McMinnville, right here, and started his own winery there. And he got very, kind of the opposite of Bruce Beal. He said, I am going to make very specific Pinot Noir. So at his McMinnville estate, every wine is on a specific block. So he's got different blocks of land that have just slightly different soil makeups. And he, until 2 years ago, wasn't ever even blending those blocks together. He was just like making his Cygnus block and his basalt block and his Gestalt block, because he was so excited about the very specific soil types and microclimates of each of these little blocks on his estate that are all just side by side. So it is sort of like, if you want to find some of the most passionate, the most knowledgeable winemakers, a lot of them do end up in Oregon. And they're one of the new AVAs. AVAs are American Viticultural Areas, and Willamette Valley is an AVA. But within Willamette Valley, there are a bunch of sub-AVAs. And one of them is called Van Duzer Corridor. And it's one of these corridors where the wind comes in from the Pacific coast and cools the area. And I think you're going to start seeing some very exciting wines labeled Van Duzer Corridor in the next few years. Great question. Any other questions? No? All right. Well, shall we move on? I mean, you can keep sipping wine number one. And if you've finished it, that's absolutely fine.
Yeah,
specifically ordered 2 of them so that I could have an actual glass of it.
Really smart.
I thought if you're going to discuss Pinots and have 2 stars, that it was deserving of a double taste.
Yes, exactly. Because a lot of these times it's 4 wines. So only having 2. Yes, of course. Good thinking. Good thinking ahead. So as we've talked about Burgundy as sort of like the ultimate for Pinot Noir, let's move on to the next slide and wine number 2. Wine number 2 is from a producer called Domaine Daniel Rion, and what of the, you know, there are sometimes funny coincidences that come up that you didn't realize were going to come up. But the Beale family that I talked about earlier was 2 brothers and a sister, and the Rion family is also 2 brothers and a sister that are running the estate. They have a 3rd brother as well who has left and is making his own wine, and his wines are called Patrice Rion. Patrice Rion has set out on his own, but these are the siblings that make Daniel Rion. Daniel Rion is an estate that started with their father. Their father inherited just a couple of acres of land, hectares of land in Vosne Romanée, which is one of the sub-regions of Burgundy, and was able to continue to add vineyard lands in Nuits Saint-Georges and Vosne Romanée, and was able to continue to make wine. And his sons and daughter have really grown the winery to the place where it is now. And you're drinking the 2018, wine number 2 is the 2018 Bourgogne. And this, the label that you see on the screen is a slightly older label. The 2018 vintage is the very first vintage where they have a new label that's called Bourgogne Côte d'Or. And this is a new appellation, a new thing that they're able to put on labels in Burgundy, is this Bourgogne Côte d'Or. And if you go to the next slide, we can see Burgundy. So that's a map of France, of course, and then the arrows pointing to Burgundy, and then a little bit of a closer up on Burgundy on the right side of the screen. And at the top of, well, Chablis is actually part of Burgundy, but that Côte, where it says Côte de Nuit and Côte de Beaune, those are the premier vineyard areas in Burgundy. And that the 2 of them together, Côte de Nuit and Côte de Beaune, are also known as Côte d'Or, slopes of gold. So you can make Bourgogne wine from all of these areas. You can make Bourgogne in Chablis, you can make Bourgogne in Beaujolais and Mâconnais, and Bourgogne is just the general appellation for a wine from Burgundy. But the wines from the Côte d'Or are a little bit more special. The lands there are spectacular for growing these grapes. The climate there is impeccable. So that area wanted to be able to differentiate their Bourgogne, their Burgundy wine, from the rest of the Burgundies. Even and of course you can get a wine that says Côte de Nuit, and you can get a wine that says even more specific within Côte de Nuit or Côte de Beaune. But if a producer in those regions wants to blend grapes from multiple vintages in their Côte de Nuit, they need to call it just Burgundy, Bourgogne. And so, you know, if they blend grapes from Côte de Nuit and Côte de Beaune, but they wanted to be able to differentiate their wines from these spectacular Côte d'Or vineyards. So this bottle, if you look at it, says Bourgogne Côte d'Or on the front of it. So you know you're getting special Burgundy. And, oh yeah. The nose on this is very nice as well. It's a good night for drinking Burgundy. Thank goodness. Yeah, the fruit is a little bit more subdued. I think the Stringtown to me is just like raspberry jam almost, but this to me, I'm getting strawberry fruit. I'm getting a little kind of damp soil, but it's just a little bit more subtle to me. Yes, it's a really lovely, intense wine. Really beautiful, and it kind of makes me want to eat some food. Although lots of things make me want to eat some food. I'm excited about this. I've been excited about Daniel Rion for many years. This is the estate, and the estate is in Nuit Saint-Georges, and that's where the wine is made. And they just bring all their grapes there. But another favorite book of mine, this is really the first wine book I ever got was The Wine Bible by Karen McNeil. And I think that's an incredible book. I love that book. But the first serious wine book I got was this book, which is called The New France by Andrew Jefford. And I got this when I was really first studying wine, which would have been in like 2001. And this is 1999, I think, is when the copyright on this book is. So it's not necessarily the new France anymore, because that was a long time ago, over 20 years ago. But in this book, Andrew Jefford mentions the producers that he really likes a lot. And I spent so much time when I was first learning about wine, studying all of these producers, and Daniel Rion is one of them. And he's a really great writer. He writes for Decanter and writes for a lot of other publications as well. If you ever want to read some very poetical wine writing, look for Andrew Jefford. But what he said about Daniel Rion way back then, which I still agree with, pungent yet accessible red wines from Nuit, Vaughan, and Chambol, produced now by two brothers, Christophe and Olivier Rion, and sister Pascal, based on a long tradition of near-organic viticulture and ceaseless cellar experimentation. In addition to the fine spread of reds, you also find one of Burgundy's leading Pinot Blanc whites, their Nuit Saint-Georges Les Terres Blanches. So it was exciting to me to find this wine, and I work with this wine now, and to have finally brought it around full circle, that I'm getting through all of these great producers that Andrew Jefford talked about back in those days. Yeah. So Burgundy, the ultimate. And I think that day when I asked, can you please help me understand why Burgundy is so great? If somebody would have poured me a glass of this, I think I would have figured it out right away. It's just really delicious right away. And like I was saying, sometimes Burgundy, is a little bit more shy and doesn't come out right away. But I think that this is just really, really yummy right now. If you've got any of the Stringtown left and can taste them side by side, I think it's a really good example of Old World Pinot Noir and New World Pinot Noir. Of course, New World is countries that were settled or colonized, and Old World is the countries that had, kings and queens and sent out settlers. But there are generally some specific things. New World bright fruit, absolutely. Yes, Jim, you nailed it. New World leads with the fruit. whereas Old World generally leads with the more earthy notes. So, yeah, Old World bright acidity, yes, very, very frequently bright acidity. Although you can get some New Zealand Sauvignon Blancs that have pretty bright acidity as well. It's the earthy notes that are really that really let you know. And when I put my nose in both of these glasses, I do get fruit on both of them. But when I take a sip of the Stringtown, and then taste what lingers on my palate after I've swallowed, it's still for me that raspberry. It's like very, very yummy, juicy raspberry, juicy fruit, like just like Jim said. But when I take a sip of the Daniel Rion, I get those nice fruit notes on the palate. But what lingers is more kind of herbs, like maybe some rosemary, and more that sort of subtle damp earth flavor a little bit. So that's kind of, if I were blind tasting these, I hope, you know, it's always easy to blind taste when you know what the wines are. But I hope that that's what I would get if I was blind tasting them, and I would be able to say, yes, wine number 2 is Old World, wine number 1 is New World. And I hope that I would be able to guess that it's Pinot Noir. And I think that I could. Pinot Noir is generally red fruits. So we've got raspberries and strawberries. Is anybody getting any other red fruits on these wines? I think on the Daniel Rion, I get just a tiny bit of cranberry as well. Yes, Jim, that's a good question. It does seem like, and a lot of times too, I mean, there's certainly Old World wines that use a lot of oak. Well, like Bordeaux certainly generally uses a lot of oak. But yes, the oak treatment is very light, you know, if at all, on this Stringtown Pinot Noir. And you know, there are a couple of reasons for that. One of the big reasons is that Pinot Noir is so delicate that it can easily be overwhelmed with the oak flavors. And because Bruce Beal is really working to find superb fruit, he doesn't want to overwhelm it with any of those oak flavors. Another reason why winemakers might choose to not use oak is that oak is super expensive. So, I mean, there are producers in the Old World that are using super large oak barrels, like you could gather 6 or 7 people and have a party in these oak barrels if they were empty. They're ginormous oak barrels, and they will reuse them year after year after year after year after year. They'll clean them. So, you know, that's a big expense the first year, but after that, the cost is diminishing. But a lot of the, you know, I mean, if you've toured any winery in California, you've gone into the barrel room likely, and you've seen, you know, stacks and stacks and stacks of these 225 liter usually barrels. And those are very expensive when they're new, and they give that beautiful vanilla, cinnamon, nutmeg sheen of oak to the wines that you taste that are aged in those barrels. But they are very, very expensive, and they can take away from a delicate grape. Cabernet Sauvignon can usually stand up to those barrels pretty nicely, and Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, you kind of like some oak on those. but with Pinot Noir, there's something beautiful about just letting the grape speak on its own. So I think a combination of those two things, Jim, is why there's less oak or no oak on the Stringtown.
Great question.
Great question. I think we have a picture of some of Danielle Rion's vineyards as well on the next slide. And that looks beautiful. Looks like a place we should all go visit soon, right? Does anybody else have any questions about these lovely wines? Or about anything? I know, Sancerre is very close to Chablis, Jim. Yeah, you're absolutely right. You want to go back to that slide? And really, when you, there is a ring of soil, it's called Kimmeridgian soil, that is very prominent, a prominent soil type in Sancerre and in Chablis. And when you see them this close, it makes sense that the soil type is the same. I think that one of the things that happens regularly is that we look at individual regions on a map and we don't see how close they are to the next region. I have only recently realized how close Provence is to Liguria in Italy. You know, if I had traveled between the two, I would know. But you look at the Italian map separately from the French map. You don't look at, you know, especially when you're looking at wine maps, it's all very, you know, settled on one region, and so you don't realize how close these areas are. And when you find that out, then it makes sense that some of the grapes that they grow in Provence are the same grapes that they grow in Liguria. But you don't, you know, looking at this, it's like, where, if you look at this map, where's Italy? France is just a little shape that pops out on its own, and it's disconnected from anywhere else in the world. And that's the way I've studied wine. You know, it's like, oh, I'm going to study France. I'm going to study France for 3 weeks. You know, now I'm going to study Italy, and you know, you might study connections between the regions of France, but you don't study the connections between the regions of France and the regions of Italy. Maybe that's a new way of wine instruction. Maybe Ian and I should work on a project.
Yeah,
of a new way of wine instruction.
I think that would be really cool. And I also am really fascinated when so many of the vintners that have been featured on a variety of these classes speak to the similar latitude specifically with some areas of California and other parts of the world. And that placement on the world map is really fascinating. I think it came up when we were tasting wines from Chile, if I'm not mistaken, even.
Okay, yeah.
We talked about that, and maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, no, absolutely, because it's about, you know, the distance from the sun, and you know, so even though it's on the other side of the globe, it still has those same, you know, similar climatic influences. It's also very bizarre to think about South American wines because their seasons are the exact opposite. So that's, you know, it's always important to remember, if you're tasting a vintage of wine from the Southern Hemisphere, you need to remember that vintage is an extra half year older than what we're thinking of our vintages. And it's also a reason why people like Paul Hobbs, great Napa, California winemakers might go to, Argentina to make wine, and why Bordeaux winemakers will go to Argentina or Chile or Australia to make wine, or vice versa, because the dormant periods are offset. So if you need to be there for harvest, you can't. It's hard to be there for Bordeaux harvest and Napa harvest. That's really almost impossible. But it's easy to be there for Bordeaux harvest and Chile harvest because it's 6 months apart. So yeah, just like looking at the big picture of the world and where things are grown. And I think it's also going to be fascinating as the climate continues to warm, what grapes are going to do well in regions. Is it going to get to the point where it's too hot for, is it going to get to be too hot for Pinot Noir in Oregon? Is it going to have to be, moving everything, further north in order to achieve the same beautiful, balanced fruit that you can get in these areas now.
And do you think the really amazing wineries that are really going strong in Santa Barbara, Los Olivos, are they benefiting from that fog, keeping cool? Do you think that's the reason?
Absolutely. And all the way up the coast, all the way up the West Coast, that fog is beneficial. It's beneficial in the places that we know and that we've gotten to visit, like Santa Barbara and like Sonoma, but it's also very beneficial in less frequented but very great wine growing areas like Monterey, and definitely all the way up into Oregon. And as I was mentioning, that Van Duzer corridor, the areas that allow that cool air to come in deeper into the valley are going to continue to benefit from that. And it's just a matter of the amount of time between when it comes in and when it burns off, and how can you accommodate those changes. But we're still making great wine. We're still able to make great wine around the world, and we can still drink it. So cheers to that, and hopefully it lasts. Oh, I saw something in the chat. Limestone and Burgundy, limestone and Barolo. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and the soil types are so influential as well. And it's fascinating. I was able to tour in Austria and went to a bunch of wineries on the Wachau River in the Wachau region. And every single winery had their soil types. There had been someone who would, cut into a section of their wineries and pull. And so they would have this kind of almost like art on the wall of the different layers of soil in each of their different vineyards. And you could see clearly the similarities, but there were also major differences, vineyard to vineyard, spot to spot, even in this place that has a lot of, that's all. It seems like it would all be exactly the same. But it's exciting to look at all these soil types and what an influence limestone definitely, Jim, has, and an influence that volcanic soil has. And the volcanic soil in Oregon has a very positive influence on Pinot Noir. That isn't something that you get so much in Burgundy, but it's making great wines. And yeah, it's just fascinating. And that's the thing too about wine study, is that the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. I'm always sort of envious of the people that have it all figured out. I know that they haven't had the horrible feeling of going so deep and realizing how much you don't know. And I'll also say, there are things that you learn. You listen to a winemaker, you listen to an educator, and you learn a specific thing, and then down the road, like I always learned that there's a piece of winemaking. You have the alcoholic fermentation, and that's when the juice turns into wine. But then there's another thing called malolactic fermentation, and it's really not a fermentation, it's a transformation of the malic acids, which are like apple acids, into lactic acids, which are like yogurt acids. And that happens in a lot of different white wines. And if you have ever had a Chardonnay that's a creamy Chardonnay or buttery Chardonnay, that's because of the malolactic transformation. So the wine has gone through this transformation. And it's something that happens naturally, but you can encourage it or you can discourage it. And so sometimes you'll taste a Chardonnay that isn't buttery at all. And that's because the winemaker has blocked that malolactic transformation. And so the acids that you're tasting are still those malic acids. So when I first learned about this, I learned that with white wines, it's a decision that the winemaker makes if they want to have it go through malo or not. But that with red wines, all red wines go through full malolactic. And that's the way it needs to happen. And if a red wine didn't go through full malo, it would taste weird. And I learned that and believed that and shared that. And then I get into conversations with winemakers and they say, well, that's less and less the case. And that more and more red winemakers are stopping that malolactic transformation. And this goes back to the conversation we were just having about the climate warming, and that it's harder as it gets warmer and warmer to keep those natural acids in the grapes through the winemaking, through harvest and through the winemaking process. So in order to have some acid in the wine, some winemakers are not making the red wines go through all of the malolactic. And so they get a little bit of that bright appley fruit in the red wines. And that was something that I totally knew that was what happened with every single red wine. And there was one weird wine that I tasted that they didn't put their red through malo. And I was like, you're the only one in the world. That I talked to a major, Oregon Pinot Noir maker, and he's like, nope, that happens. It's like, what? So it just goes to show, you never know. You never know. And I think that the person who taught me that's what they knew. And maybe it's all changed now, or maybe their breadth of knowledge wasn't, I don't know. But you've just got to keep being curious You've got to keep your mind open, and you have to just listen, and then research as well to go, well, was that guy full of crap? Who knows? But it's fascinating to me, and that's why the wine world will never ever get boring, because there's new things all the time. There's new regions, as you mentioned earlier, Lisa, all these new regions that are coming up. There's new winemakers, there's new techniques, there's new grapes, there's all kinds of exciting things in the world of wine. And I love it. And I'm glad you all do too.
Yeah, we really appreciate you sharing your selections with us, Dana, because I know we were talking about King Estate earlier, and I mean, they're at one of our biggest events of the year, Stars of Pinot, and they're there almost every year. They're a benchmark, but people may have not heard of, Stringtown and all these cool little side projects that you have to have somebody introduce to you, or like these small producers like Daniel Briand, who, I was looking for for some photos of them, and they don't have websites. Their website is
right.
existent, so you have to have somebody introduce you to like these great producers. So you can, so we really appreciate you, and that's what we do. That's why we do what we do here on Zoom Into Wine. So, and you can of course find these wines on Merchant of Wine. If you loved them, and if you want to get more bottles, Lori, you totally can. There is a code that we have for this evening. It's DF on Pinot. I put it in the Zoom chat. So for the next 24 hours, these wines will be 20% off. And thank you again for joining us for this Pinot celebration. And next week we're having a zero alcohol, a very interesting zero alcohol with Matthew Kainer. So it's just like an interesting Canadian company that's got these like really neat wines for next week. So I know sometimes people are like, well, if the alcohol's not there, then I'm not going to participate. But this is it'll be a very interesting Zoom. So apples and oranges, but if you'd like to come join us. And you also mentioned Paul Hobbs, Dana, and Paul Hobbs will be on Zoom with us this month as well. We'll have to check the exact date, but yeah, he's on this December. And if you check out zoomintowine.com, you'll see what date he is joining us. So, and with that, does anybody else have any last questions or comments for Dana? Lori? I feel like Lori has something. You just have such a great smile, Lori. I love seeing you on Zoom.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Dana. They're delicious. This was really informative. Yay. I had a lot of fun.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. All right. Have a great night. Enjoy your Wednesday.
Thank you.
Bye now.